Mark Holloway stared at the ultrasound image in his trembling hands, his world crumbling around him. The grainy black and white picture should have been a moment of joy, a celebration of new life. Instead, it was the final piece of evidence in a betrayal so profound it threatened to tear his family apart. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, his wife of 5 years, sat on the edge of their bed, her face streaked with tears. "Mark, How? Long?" he repeated, each word sharp enough to cut. She flinched, her hand unconsciously moving to her slightly swollen belly. 6 months, she admitted, her voice breaking. "It happened when you were away on that business trip to Seattle." Mark closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words crush him. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of pretending everything was normal while she carried another man's child. And not just any man's child. "Does Jason know?" he asked, referring to his younger brother. Sarah nodded, unable to meet his gaze. He wants to be involved, to take responsibility." A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips. Of course, Jason wanted to be involved. Golden boy Jason, who could do no wrong in their parents' eyes. Jason, who had always been given every opportunity, every advantage, while Mark had to fight for scraps of attention and approval. "Get out," Mark said quietly. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "What?" "Get out of my house," he repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Pack your things and leave, now." "Mark, please," she begged, reaching for him. "We can work this out. I made a mistake, but I love you. We can—" "Love?" He spat the word like poison. "You don't betray someone you love, Sarah, and you sure as hell don't sleep with their brother." He stood, towering over her, his face a mask of pain and fury. "I want you gone by the time I get back. Go to Jason. Go to my parents. I don't care. Just get out of my sight." Without waiting for a response, Mark stormed out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out the front door. He got into his car, his movements mechanical, driven by a need to be anywhere but here. As he pulled out of the driveway, his phone buzzed. A text from Jason. "We need to talk, bro. I'm so sorry." Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Sorry. As if that word could even begin to cover the magnitude of what they'd done. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Boston, his mind a whirlwind of memories and betrayals. He thought of all the family dinners where Jason had sat across from him, smiling and joking, while knowing he'd slept with Mark's wife. He thought of his parents, always quick to sing Jason's praises while overlooking Mark's accomplishments. Mark had always been the responsible one, the hard-working one. He'd put himself through college, started his own tech startup from scratch, and married the woman he thought was the love of his life. And what did he have to show for it? A cheating wife, a backstabbing brother, and parents who had never truly appreciated him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Mark found himself parked in front of his office building. The sleek, modern structure housed the company he'd built from the ground up. Holloway Tech was his baby, the one thing in his life that had never let him down. He walked into the empty office, the security guard nodding in recognition as he passed. In the silence of the deserted workspace, Mark felt he could finally breathe. Here, surrounded by the fruits of his labor, he didn't have to be the disappointing son or the cuckolded husband. Here, he was in control. Sitting at his desk, Mark opened his laptop and began to work. Lines of code flowed from his fingers, a complex algorithm taking shape on the screen. He lost himself in the work, finding solace in the logical, predictable world of programming. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Mark sat back, exhausted but satisfied. He'd made a breakthrough that could potentially revolutionize their latest project. His phone, silent all night, suddenly came to life. A barrage of missed calls and messages from Sarah, Jason, and his parents lit up the screen. Mark ignored them all, focusing instead on an email that had just arrived. It was from a potential investor expressing interest in Holloway Tech's latest innovation. The amount mentioned made Mark's eyes widen. This could be the big break he'd been working towards for years. As he read through the email, a plan began to form in Mark's mind. He'd been betrayed, humiliated, and underestimated by those closest to him. But now he had a chance to prove them all wrong, to show them exactly what Mark Holloway was capable of. With renewed determination, he began drafting a response to the investor. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over the Boston skyline. It was a new day, and for Mark Holloway, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter where he would no longer be defined by his family's expectations or betrayals. A chapter where he would rise above it all and show the world, and those who had wronged him, exactly what he was made of. As he hit send on the email, Mark allowed himself a small, grim smile. The game had changed, and he was ready to play. 3 years had passed since that fateful day when Mark's world had shattered. In that time, Holloway Tech had risen from a promising startup to a titan in the tech industry. The breakthrough Mark had made that night in his office had indeed been revolutionary, catapulting the company into the spotlight and attracting investors from around the globe. Mark stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, overlooking the Boston skyline. At 35, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his once unkempt hair now styled with precision. Success had changed him, hardened him. The boyish charm that had once softened his features was replaced by a sharp, calculating gaze. A knock on the door interrupted his musings. "Come in," he called, not turning from the window. "Mr. Holloway," his assistant Rachel said as she entered. "Your 2 o'clock is here." Mark nodded, finally turning to face her. "Send them in." Rachel hesitated, an uncharacteristic nervousness in her demeanor. "Sir, it's your brother." For a moment, Mark's carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing a flash of pain and anger. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, professional demeanor. "I see," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Show him in." Rachel nodded and left, returning moments later with Jason in tow. The years had not been kind to Mark's younger brother. Where Jason had once been the picture of confidence and charm, he now looked haggard and worn. His designer clothes hung loosely on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Mark," Jason said, his voice hoarse. "Thanks for seeing me." Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked to his desk and sat down, gesturing for Jason to take a seat across from him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and buried resentments. Finally, Mark spoke. "What do you want, Jason?" Jason flinched at the coldness in his brother's voice. I I need help, Mark. I'm in trouble." "Trouble?" Mark raised an eyebrow. "What kind of trouble?" Jason ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Financial trouble, big trouble. I I made some bad investments, took out some loans I shouldn't have, and now I'm in debt, deep debt." Mark leaned back in his chair, his face impassive. "How much?" "2 million," Jason whispered, unable to meet his brother's gaze. A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips. $2 million. That's quite a hole you've dug yourself, little brother." I know, Jason said, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "But I can pay it back, I swear. I just need some time, alone to tide me over. Please, Mark, you're my only hope." Mark stood up abruptly, walking back to the window. He stared out at the city, his mind racing. Part of him, the part that still remembered the brother he'd once loved, wanted to help. But another part, the part that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and ambition, saw an opportunity. "Tell me, Jason," he said, his back still to his brother. "How are Sarah and the baby?" The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Jason's intake of breath was audible in the quiet office. They're fine," Jason stammered. "Liam just started kindergarten. He's a smart kid, Mark, just like you." Mark turned, his eyes cold. Don't you dare try to play that card with me." Jason slumped in his chair, defeated. "I'm sorry, Mark, for everything. What we did, it was unforgivable. I know that. But please, I'm begging you, help me out of this mess, and I swear you'll never hear from me again." For a long moment, Mark said nothing. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and opened his laptop. With a few quick keystrokes, he pulled up Jason's financial records. His tech company had eyes everywhere, and it hadn't been hard to keep tabs on his brother over the years. $2 million, Mark mused, scrolling through the data. Plus interest, late fees, you're looking at closer to $3 million to clear this debt completely. Jason's face paled. $3 million? But I can't. You can't pay it, Mark finished for him. No, I don't imagine you can. He closed the laptop with a decisive click. Here's what's going to happen, Jason. I'll pay off your debt. Hope bloomed on Jason's face, quickly replaced by wariness as Mark continued. In return, you'll sign over any claim to Mom and Dad's estate. You'll move out of state. I don't care where, as long as it's far from here. And you'll never contact me or anyone associated with me ever again. Is that clear? Jason stared at his brother, shock written across his features. But but what about Liam? He's your nephew, Mark. Don't you want to? Liam is not my concern, Mark cut him off sharply. Those are my terms, Jason. Take them or leave them. Tears welled up in Jason's eyes as the full weight of the situation hit him. This was more than a financial transaction. It was exile, a complete severing of family ties. Okay, he whispered, his voice breaking. Okay, I'll do it. Mark nodded, his face betraying no emotion. Rachel will draw up the paperwork, sign it, and the money will be transferred immediately. As if on cue, Rachel entered with a stack of documents. Jason signed them with a shaking hand, not bothering to read the fine print. When it was done, he stood, looking lost and broken. Goodbye, Mark, he said softly. I truly am sorry for everything. Mark didn't respond. He watched impassively as his brother walked out of his office and out of his life. When the door closed behind Jason, Mark allowed himself a moment of weakness. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pushed down the turmoil of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. When he opened his eyes again, the mask was back in place. He had won this round, exacting a measure of revenge against one of those who had betrayed him. But it was just the beginning. Mark turned back to his computer, pulling up his parents' contact information. It was time to settle another old score. The game was far from over. The Holloway family home stood as it always had, a stately Victorian nestled in the suburbs of Boston. Mark sat in his car, parked across the street, staring at the familiar facade. It had been years since he'd last set foot inside, yet the sight of it still stirred a complex mix of emotions within him. With a deep breath, he stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes and made his way up the path. The doorbell's chime echoed through the house, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. The door swung open, revealing Eleanor Holloway, Mark's mother. Her eyes widened in surprise. Mark? She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. What are you doing here? Hello, Mother, Mark said, his voice carefully neutral. May I come in? Eleanor hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. Of course, of course. Your father's in the study. I'll go get him. Mark entered the foyer, memories washing over him. Family photos lined the walls, chronicling years of milestones and celebrations. He noticed that the most recent ones featured Jason, Sarah, and their son Liam. His jaw clenched involuntarily. Mark? His father's voice broke through his thoughts. George Holloway stood at the entrance to the living room, a mix of surprise and wariness on his face. This is unexpected. Hello, Dad, Mark replied, turning to face his parents. We need to talk. The three Holloways settled in the living room, an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Mark sat across from his parents, studying them. They had aged since he'd last seen them, wrinkles etched deeper into their faces, hair grayer than he remembered. So, George began, clearing his throat, to what do we owe this visit? It's been quite some time. Mark leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I saw Jason yesterday, he said, watching their reactions carefully. Eleanor's face lit up. Oh, how is he? And Sarah and little Liam? We haven't heard from them in a while, and we've been so worried. They're fine, Mark cut her off, his tone sharp. But that's not why I'm here. George frowned, sensing the tension in his elder son's voice. What's going on, Mark? Mark sat back, his face a mask of calm. Jason came to me for help. He's in debt, serious debt. His parents exchanged worried glances. How serious? George asked. $3 million, Mark replied, watching as shock registered on their faces. He made some bad investments, took out loans he couldn't repay. The usual Jason story, isn't it? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Oh, my poor boy. Mark, please tell me you're helping him. A bitter smile twisted Mark's lips. I've taken care of it, he said. The debt's been paid, but there were conditions. George leaned forward, his brow furrowed. What kind of conditions? Jason and his family have agreed to move out of state, Mark explained, his voice devoid of emotion. He's also signed over any claim to your estate. His parents stared at him in stunned silence. Finally, George found his voice. You forced your brother out of the state, away from his family. Mark's eyes flashed dangerously. His family? You mean the woman who was my wife? The child that should have been mine? That family? Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling. Mark, sweetheart, we know you were hurt, but... Hurt? Mark interrupted, his carefully constructed facade cracking. You think I was hurt? You have no idea what I went through. And where were you? Where were you when my life was falling apart? George's face hardened. Now, see here, Mark, we did our best. Your best? Mark laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. Your best was always reserved for Jason. It didn't matter what I achieved, what I sacrificed. It was always Jason this, Jason that. He stood up, pacing the room. Do you know what it's like to work your entire life for approval that never comes? To watch your younger brother be handed everything you've ever wanted on a silver platter? And then to have him betray you in the worst possible way? His parents sat in stunned silence, the weight of years of unspoken resentment hanging heavy in the air. Mark took a deep breath, regaining his composure. But that's all in the past now. I didn't come here to rehash old grievances. I came to inform you of the changes in our family dynamic. He turned to face them, his expression cold and businesslike. From this point forward, I will be managing your estate and finances. You'll receive a monthly allowance, but any major expenditures will need my approval. George jumped to his feet, face flushed with anger. Now wait just a minute. You can't just come in here and... I can, and I have. Mark cut him off. Check your accounts, Dad. Check your property deeds. It's all been transferred to me, legally and binding. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But, but how? Mark smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Did you ever bother to read the documents Jason signed yesterday? The ones giving me power of attorney over the family assets? The ones you both signed last year when you were so proud of my company's success that you wanted to invest? The color drained from his parents' faces as the realization dawned on them. They had handed over control of their lives to their eldest son, the one they had consistently overlooked and underestimated. Why, Mark? Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why would you do this to us? Mark's expression softened for a moment, a flicker of the boy he once was shining through. Because you're my parents, he said softly. And despite everything, I don't want to see you struggle in your old age, but I also can't trust you to make the right decisions. Not anymore. He moved towards the door, pausing to look back at them. I'll have my assistant send over the details of your new financial arrangements. If you need anything, you can contact her. As he reached for the doorknob, his father's voice stopped him. Mark, George said, his voice breaking. Son, we're sorry for everything. Mark stood still for a moment, his hand on the door. Without turning around, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, Dad, but sometimes sorry isn't enough. With that, he walked out, leaving his parents sitting in stunned silence. As he got back into his car, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had confronted his past, taken control, and set the stage for a future on his own terms. As he drove away from the house he grew up in, Mark allowed himself a small smile. The game had changed, and he was now firmly in control. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. And for the first time in years, Mark Holloway felt truly free. 6 months had passed since Mark's confrontation with his family. Holloway Tech continued to thrive, its innovative products dominating the market. Mark threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, channeling all his energy into pushing his company to greater heights. On a crisp autumn morning, Mark sat in his office, reviewing the latest financial reports. A soft knock on the door interrupted his concentration. Come in, he called out, not looking up from his computer screen. Rachel, his ever-efficient assistant, entered the room. Mr. Holloway, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent. Mark frowned, finally looking up. Who is it? Rachel hesitated for a moment. It's your ex-wife, sir, Sarah. The pen Mark had been holding clattered to the desk. For a moment he sat frozen, a myriad of emotions flashing across his face, before settling back into his usual mask of calm indifference. Send her in, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Rachel nodded and left. A few moments later, Sarah walked into the office. Time had been kinder to her than to Jason. She still possessed the grace and beauty that had first attracted Mark, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hello, Mark, she said softly, standing awkwardly by the door. Mark gestured to the chair across from his desk. Have a seat, Sarah. What brings you here? Sarah sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I heard about what happened with Jason and your parents. I wanted to see how you were doing. A bitter laugh escaped Mark's lips. After 6 years of silence, now you want to know how I'm doing? Sarah flinched at the harshness in his tone. I know I have no right to be here, Mark. What we did, it was unforgivable, But I couldn't stay away any longer, not after hearing about everything that's happened. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her. And how exactly did you hear about it? I was under the impression that Jason had moved your family out of state. Sarah looked down, unable to meet his gaze. He did. We're in Colorado now, but things haven't been easy. Jason's been struggling to find work, and with the restrictions you put on your parents' finances. Ah, Mark said, understanding dawning. So this isn't about checking on my well-being. You're here for money. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide. No, that's not. I mean, yes, we could use help, but that's not why I came. I genuinely wanted to see you, Mark, to apologize, to try and make things right. Mark stood up, walking to the window. He stared out at the Boston skyline, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to throw Sarah out of his office, to continue the cycle of hurt and revenge. But another part, a part he thought long buried, ached at seeing her again. How's the boy? He asked, his back still to her. Liam, isn't it? Sarah's voice softened. He's wonderful, smart, kind. He reminds me so much of you sometimes. Mark turned, his expression unreadable. He's not my son, Sarah. I know, she whispered, but sometimes I wish things had been different. Silence fell between them, heavy with regret and unspoken words. Finally, Mark returned to his desk and sat down. What exactly do you want from me, Sarah? He asked, his voice tired. Sarah took a deep breath. I want a chance to make amends. For all of us. Jason, your parents, me. We've all made terrible mistakes. But your family, Mark. Despite everything, that hasn't changed. Mark's jaw clenched. Family, he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. My family betrayed me, Sarah. They hurt me in ways I'm not sure I'll ever fully recover from. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. I know, and we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to make up for that if you'll let us. Please, Mark, give us a chance. For a long moment, Mark said nothing. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a framed photograph. It was an old family picture taken at a 4th of July barbecue years ago. Everyone was smiling, happy, unaware of the storm that was to come. I've spent years building walls, Mark said softly, running his finger over the image. Protecting myself, focusing on success, on proving everyone wrong, and now... Sarah leaned forward, hope glimmering in her eyes. And now? Mark looked up, meeting her gaze. And now, I'm not sure those walls are protecting me anymore. Maybe they're just keeping me isolated. He stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of Sarah. I can't forgive you, not yet. Maybe not ever fully, but maybe it's time to start trying. Sarah stood as well, tears streaming down her face. That's all we can ask for, Mark. A chance to try. Mark nodded, a small, sad smile on his face. It won't be easy. There's a lot of hurt, a lot of anger to work through. But I'm willing to take the first step. He walked to his office door and opened it. Rachel, he called out, clear my schedule for the rest of the day and get in touch with my parents. Set up a dinner for next week. As he turned back to Sarah, he saw a glimmer of the future. Not perfect, not unmarred by the past, but a future with the possibility of healing, of rebuilding what was broken. Let's go get some coffee, he said to Sarah. We have a lot to talk about. As they left the office together, Mark felt a shift within himself. The walls he had built so carefully began to crumble, making way for something new. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult conversations and painful memories. But for the first time in years, Mark Holloway felt ready to face it. Not alone, but with the family he had pushed away for so long. The game had changed once again, but this time the stakes were higher than money or success. This time the prize was the chance at redemption, forgiveness, and the rekindling of bonds that had once seemed irreparably broken. A year had passed since Sarah's unexpected visit to Mark's office. The journey of reconciliation had been far from easy, filled with heated arguments, tearful confessions, and moments of doubt. But slowly, steadily, the Holloway family began to heal. On a warm summer evening, Mark stood in the backyard of his childhood home, watching as his family gathered for a barbecue. It was the first time in years that they had all been together like this, and the atmosphere was a mix of cautious optimism and lingering tension. George was at the grill, expertly flipping burgers and occasionally shooting nervous glances at Mark. Eleanor flitted about, making sure everyone had drinks, and trying a bit too hard to keep the conversation flowing. Jason stood awkwardly to one side, nursing a beer and looking like he wasn't sure he belonged. And then there was Sarah, sitting at the picnic table with 7-year-old Liam helping him with a jigsaw puzzle. The boy's laughter carried across the yard, a sound that still stirred complicated emotions in Mark's chest. "Hey," a voice said beside him. Mark turned to see Rachel, his assistant turned friend, holding out a beer. "I thought you could use this." Mark took the bottle with a grateful smile. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I'm not sure I could have faced this alone." Rachel squeezed his arm reassuringly. "You're not alone, Mark. Not anymore." As if on cue, Liam looked up from his puzzle and spotted Mark. "Uncle Mark!" he called out, waving enthusiastically. "Come see, I'm almost done." Mark hesitated for a moment, then made his way over to the picnic table. He sat down across from Sarah and Liam, examining the half-completed puzzle. "Wow, buddy," he said, genuinely impressed. "You're doing a great job. What's it going to be when it's finished?" Liam beamed at the praise. "It's the Boston skyline. See, there's your building right there." He pointed to a piece that indeed resembled the Holloway Tech headquarters. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. That's right, Liam. Good eye." Sarah watched the interaction with a mix of joy and sadness. "He's been talking about you nonstop since we moved back," she said softly. "He's so proud to have a famous uncle." Mark met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They had a long way to go, but moments like these made the difficult journey worthwhile. The evening progressed, the initial awkwardness gradually giving way to more natural interactions. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the gathering, Mark found himself sitting with his parents on the porch swing. "This is nice," Eleanor said, her voice tentative. "Having everyone together again." George nodded in agreement. "Son, I know we've said it before, but we truly are sorry. For everything." Mark took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of resentment and hurt. But he also felt something else, a desire to move forward, to build something new from the ashes of the past. "I know, Dad," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, too, for shutting you out, for the way I handled things. We've all made mistakes." Eleanor reached out, gently taking Mark's hand in hers. "But we're here now," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "We're trying. That has to count for something, right?" Mark squeezed her hand, nodding. "It does. It counts for a lot." As the evening wound down, Mark found himself alone with Jason by the old oak tree they used to climb as kids. The brothers stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you," Mark said finally, his voice low. "What you did, it changed everything." Jason nodded, his face etched with remorse. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. But Mark, I want you to know, I'm proud of you, of everything you've accomplished, of the man you've become. Even when you were pushing us all away, I was proud to call you my brother." Mark felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He turned to face Jason, really looking at him for the first time in years. He saw the regret, the love, and the hope for redemption in his brother's eyes. "We've got a long road ahead of us," Mark said. "But I'm willing to try if you are." Jason's face broke into a relieved smile. "I am. God, Mark, I really am." As the family said their goodbyes for the evening, there was a palpable sense of change in the air. The wounds were still there, still tender to the touch, but they had begun to heal. Mark stood in the driveway watching as Jason and Sarah loaded a sleepy Liam into their car. Rachel came to stand beside him. "So," she said, bumping his shoulder lightly with hers, "how do you feel?" Mark considered the question, looking at the family he had once thought lost to him forever. "Hopeful," he said finally. "For the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful." As he drove home that night, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The betrayal, the pain, the success, and now the tentative steps towards reconciliation. He had learned that true strength lay not in isolation or revenge, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to risk being hurt again in the pursuit of healing. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks, arguments, and moments of doubt. But as Mark pulled into his driveway, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his past, confronted his demons, and come out the other side not unscathed, but unbroken. The game of life had taken yet another turn, but this time Mark Holloway was ready to play, not just to win, but to truly live. With his family by his side, flawed and human as they were, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Mark's last thought was of Liam's laughter, of his parents' hopeful smiles, of Jason's sincere apology. And for the first time in years, Mark Holloway slept peacefully, the burden of anger and resentment finally lifting from his heart.